Okay, so in this part we're going to see how classes and structs work together because they really do go very well together. So we're going to create a class with a struct inside of it as kind of one of the variable properties. And we're going to see that we can modify the struct properties by calling them through the class. So we're going to create this class, create a new instance, and then we'll see that we'll be able to actually modify the struct properties by calling the structure itself and the properties through the variable that's going to be our new class. It'll become a little clearer as our video goes on. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about structs and classes put together because the two really go hand in hand. And we're going to talk about the example of a class. So let's say we're taking a class in school, and so a class should have something like, let's just make a comment, a class should have a teacher, a subject, a location, and a location, and a location should have a building and a room number. Okay, so right off the bat we know we're going to have this class, and it's going to be a class that it's going to be of type class, and it's going to have a teacher, a subject, and a location, and the location can be a struct which has a building and a room number. Okay, so let's just go ahead and create this class. This is going to be, well, I mean, I can't think of any good name to call it other than class right now. Okay, and before we do that, we're going to first create our struct, and this is going to be location, and this is going to contain a couple variables. The first is going to be the building name, and that's just going to be an optional string, and the next is going to be a room number, and that's going to be an optional int. Okay, so then for our class what we can do, oh right, I should use the colons instead of equals. So what we're going to do within our class is we're going to create a new struct of a location. So we're going to say this variable class location equals location. Okay, so now we've put a struct inside of our class, which means that this is one of our variables which is going to be the equivalent of a struct, and right now it's just a blank struct so that we can initialize the values later. Okay, and then we're going to have another variable that's going to be a teacher, and that's just going to be a string, and we're going to have a variable subject, and that's going to be also a string, and I guess we should have a section number, and that's going to be an int. Okay, so now we have this class. I'm not going to implement the methods. We could have a bunch of different functions. They could be functions that will get stuff, set stuff, return stuff, and add stuff to lists. I'm not going to do that. I just want to demonstrate how classes and locations work together, or rather how classes and structs work together. So what we can do is, much like we've seen before, we can set the location. We can create this new struct, or create a new instance of a struct. We can say new location, and then we can equals location. And as we've seen before, we can either give it some parameters or not. So that's how we create a new struct. We could create a new class, so let's just say new class equals class, and then we do this. Again, you can't put parameters into here, but that's fine. Now we've seen how to do that before, so I'm not going to repeat it. And what I really want to show you guys is that we can modify this class locations properties directly through the class. So what we can do is we can say, let's create a new class. So let's say variable, let's call this English class equals class. Okay, and then we're going to, so we've created a new class instance, and it's called English class. So what we want to do is we want to set this class's parameters. So let's just say English class dot teacher equals, let's just say, you know what, let's just put my name. Let's say English class dot subject equals English class dot section number. I'm just going to set to be equal to, I don't know, 303, and then we'll have the English class dot location dot class location, and then what we can do from here is we can call a dot, and then we can modify the values. Okay, so we can say building name equals I don't know, what's a good building name? Let's just call this Macmillan. That seems to be a common kind of a building name. And then we can say English class dot class location dot room number equals 205 or something. Okay, so this is one of the cool things that we can do with our kind of class structs location. And look, it even tells us these properties belong to class, and these two properties belong to location. So although these two properties are also part of this class because we're creating a new location, they're of the location struct, which we're including in our class. Okay, so this is one way that we can add structs into classes if we want to kind of create a new instance within a class. And this allows us to modify the values by doing this. So by calling the class name, or rather the class name that we've given it, then we can call whatever the struct name is, and then we can call the struct property and modify it directly. So I just wanted to show you guys this because it's a really cool thing. This is how structs and classes can really work well together. Okay, so this is the final part. This is the final thing that I'm going to teach you guys. This last part will just kind of be a summary and a wrap-up where we'll kind of compare and contrast enumerations, classes and structs all side by side, and hopefully if you have any questions it will become a little clearer in this last part. Okay, so in this final part we saw how classes and structs work together. So we created a class that had a location as a struct. So it had a few different properties. It had a teacher, had a section number, had a subject, and then it had a location. And the location was a struct that itself had a building and a room number. So we saw that we created a new instance of this class, and we called it English class, and then we saw that we can actually modify the location properties through our instance of that class. So we just called English class dot location and then dot whatever property of the location we wanted to modify. So in this way the two go really well together, and it's pretty cool that you can just modify them by doing this, because in a lot of the other languages you can't. You'd have to go in and do that on a separate line and go into the struct and modify it that way. But yeah, this is a cool feature that's new to Swift 3. Okay, so now we've learned all we have to learn about enumerations, classes and structures, and this is just going to be kind of a recap and a summary of what we've learned so far. So when we talk about enumerations, we call them like this, and let's just call this new enumeration, and then we have some kind of properties in here. So case, we're going to have value 1, case value 2, or not vars, case value 2, and case value 3, and so on and so forth. So this just creates, well, it doesn't really create anything. It just says that there's this new type, in our case called new enumeration, and it can take on only one of these three values. Okay, so this is really useful for kind of defining a type that has should only be able to take on a few different values, but all these values should be fairly similar. So one of the examples we looked at was some hot drinks. So some of the hot drink values that we had were stuff like coffee, tea, hot chocolate, hot cider, and stuff like that. So that allows us to group together a bunch of similar values, and then we had the hot drink kind of enumeration up here that can only take on one of those values. Now I think the really cool thing about these enumerations is that these values themselves become the values, so we don't have to assign kind of variable values like we saw with strings or integers or anything like that. We can actually just give it this value directly. Okay, so anytime you're dealing with kind of variables that it doesn't really make sense to assign them to contain an integer value or a string or a boolean or something like that, it might be a good idea to put those in an enumeration. We saw also that we can assign attributed and raw values to each of the cases, and this just allows us to call on a case based on, the raw values allow us to call on a case based on the raw value, or kind of use that raw value somehow. It could be a string or an integer. And we also saw that the attributed values just allow us to kind of add attributes to each of these values. So for example, we could have this one be int, and then we saw that we could have, at the same time, if we want to assign raw values, we can't have attributed values. So we saw this is how to do attributed values, and then if we wanted raw values, we could do this, and it would assign a raw value to each of these, so this would contain 0, 1, and 2, unless otherwise stated. Okay, then we looked at structs, we looked at classes first. So there's going to be new class, and it should be capitalized. Actually, so should enumeration. So remember, all three classes, enumerations, and structures should all be capitalized. Let's call this new class, and then we'll have variables, some property, let's just say. And I don't know, let's just give this type string, and then variable, some other property. And let's give this type int, and then we could have some functions such as function, some function, and this could just kind of do something. This is just going to do something. Okay, so this is a class. It kind of creates a new instance when we start a new instance of the class, and classes can have properties or fields. So these are typically variables, and they can also have functions. So that's a really cool thing about classes, is that they're kind of like the building blocks of our code, where we put everything in classes, and then we can call the class, we can create a new instance, and then we can kind of modify the properties of this class by using these functions, or just by calling the class name dot and then the property and modifying it that way. Okay, then we took a look at structures or structs, and I'm just going to call this new struct. And these were similar to classes in that we can kind of define them to be properties, and they're kind of like creating a new instance. So we have a new struct, and let's just give it some property, and this could be a string, and then some other property, and this could be int or something. Okay, and we saw that we could call this new structure. So actually, I guess I should demonstrate new examples. So we could have a variable, a new class, be a new class. Okay, so this is how we create a new class object or a new class instance, and then we can modify the properties by calling a new class dot, and then what other properties we have here, some function, some other property, and so on and so forth. Okay, and then for structures, we saw that we could create them in one of two ways. We could say a new struct equals new struct, and we could either pass in some parameters that correspond with the properties, or we could just leave it as blank, in which case it would just, in this case, initialize them to nil, and basically take on the default values here. Okay, so that's enumerations, classes, and structs. Classes can contain structs if they want, but not necessarily the other way around. Enumerations just kind of allow us to group together values and kind of just assign a new type of value. So these are just basically new values of type new enumeration. This new class allows us to create a new instance that could have these properties, and structs just allow us to kind of create a new type with these properties as well. So again, you can modify these properties, you can kind of reassign them to variables and stuff. Enumerations can have raw values and attributed values. And yeah, so if there's parts of this tutorial around clear off, I suggest you go back and watch them again. And other than that, just kind of play around with them a little bit. The playground is a great tool for this, in that you can kind of just see the values right away. So for example, new struct, new class right here. So yeah, just play around with it a bit, have some fun, and yeah, so these are all just great ways to represent data really. So each has their time and place, and yeah, that's just about all I have to say about them. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I really hope you guys learned a lot, and feel free to check out our other tutorials. We've done a lot of other stuff on Swift 3, so we have a bunch of intro courses, so that talk about stuff like variables and loops and functions and if statements and stuff like that. And we also have some that deal with working with Xcode and working with the project itself, so adding UI elements like labels and buttons and stuff. Okay, cool. Thanks for watching, guys, and yeah, hopefully we'll see you next tutorial.